The night the Duchess came back from the dead, she wore white and carried proof of poison in her hands. England, 1823. The storm had been raging for 3 days, a relentless deluge that battered the ancient stone walls of the estate until the very foundations seemed to tremble under the assault of wind and rain. Inside the grand library, however, the air was still and stagnant, smelling of beeswax, old paper, and centuries of accumulated dust. Lady Clara Vance, Duchess of Exmoor, sat in a high-backed velvet chair that seemed to swallow her slender frame whole. At 24, Clara should have been in the bloom of her youth, yet her reflection in the darkened window pane showed a woman who looked far older, her spirit eroded by 2 years of a marriage that was as cold as the marble floors beneath her feet. She smoothed the skirt of her modest grey gown, her fingers trembling slightly. It was a habit she had developed recently, a nervous tic born of walking on eggshells in her own home. Her blonde hair was pulled back severely, devoid of the ribbons or jewels that other duchesses might wear to a private dinner, and her green eyes, usually so bright and observant, were dulled by a profound sense of isolation. Across the cavernous room, Alistair Sterling, the Duke of Exmoor, stood by the massive fireplace. He was a man who commanded attention simply by existing, tall and broad-shouldered, with hair as black as a raven's wing and eyes the colour of the deep, cold ocean. He was the sort of man who could silence a room with a single glance. Tonight, his back was turned to her, his posture rigid as he stared into the dying embers of the fire. He had not spoken a word to her since dinner, a meal that had been conducted in the usual excruciating silence, broken only by the scrape of silver against china and the rhythmic, mocking ticking of the grandfather clock in the hall. He had never shared a bed with her, never held her hand, never looked at her with anything other than a polite, distant indifference that hurt more than hatred ever could. She was his wife in name only, a fixture in his house like a vase or a painting, necessary for appearances but ultimately devoid of value. He turned suddenly, his movement sharp, and Clara flinched instinctively. His blue eyes swept over her, unreadable and guarded, lingering for a fraction of a second on her face before sliding away as if looking at her pained him. "I shall be retiring to my study," Alistair said, his voice deep and smooth, lacking any inflection of warmth or affection. "Do not wait up for me." Clara swallowed the lump in her throat, forcing a voice she hardly recognized as her own. "Of course, Your Grace," she whispered, the honorific tasting like ash in her mouth. She never called him Alistair. He had never invited her to. He nodded once, a curt dismissal, and strode out of the room, his heavy boots echoing on the floorboards with a finality that made Clara shudder. She listened until the sound of his footsteps faded down the corridor, leaving her alone once more with the storm outside. She felt a sudden, overwhelming urge to scream, to throw one of the priceless Ming vases against the wall, just to hear something break, just to prove that she was still alive, still capable of affecting the world around her. But she did not. She was Lady Clara, the dutiful, invisible Duchess. She rose slowly, her limbs feeling heavy as lead, and made her way to her own chambers, located in the west wing, far from the Duke's suite. Sleep, as usual, eluded her. The wind howled like a banshee around the eaves, and the rain lashed against the glass with a violence that made her shiver beneath her heavy quilts. Around midnight, a flash of lightning illuminated her room, painting the walls in stark white, followed by a crack of thunder that shook the house to its timbers. Clara sat up, her heart pounding against her ribs. She needed water. The carafe by her bed was empty. Sighing, she wrapped a thick shawl around her shoulders and lit a candle, venturing out into the dark, drafty hallway. As she passed the tall window that overlooked the central courtyard, movement caught her eye. She stopped, shielding the candle flame with her hand, and peered out into the deluge. Below, in the stable yard, a figure was mounting a horse. Even through the sheets of rain that fell like curtains of steel, she recognized the broad set of the shoulders, the way he commanded the beast with effortless strength. It was Alistair. Confusion knit her brow. Where could he possibly be going in such weather? The roads would be treacherous, little more than rivers of mud, and the wind was strong enough to topple trees. Panic flared in her chest, hot and sudden. Was he in trouble? Was there an emergency on the estate? Without thinking, fueled by a concern she knew he would not reciprocate, Clara hurried back to her room, threw on a heavy woolen cloak over her nightdress, and shoved her feet into sturdy walking boots. She had to know. If he was riding into danger, she could not simply sit here and wait for the morning to bring bad news. She slipped out of the manor through the servants' entrance, the wind immediately tearing at her cloak and soaking her hair within seconds. The cold was shocking, stealing the breath from her lungs, but she pushed forward, her boots sinking into the mud. She could see the lantern on his horse bobbing in the distance, a lone star in the darkness, heading not toward the village, but toward the old hunting lodge on the edge of the woods. It was a place that had been abandoned for years, or so she thought. Clara followed, keeping to the shadows of the ancient oaks, her boots sinking deep into the sodden earth with every step. The rain plastered her clothes to her skin, chilling her to the bone, but adrenaline kept her moving. Why would he go there? Who was he meeting in such a godforsaken storm? The questions swirled in her mind, poisonous and insistent, whispering doubts she had tried to suppress for months. When the lodge came into view, warm, orange light spilled from the cracks in the shuttered windows, cutting through the gloom. Alistair's horse was tethered under the shelter of the porch, steam rising from its flanks. Clara crept closer, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. She stepped onto the wooden porch, testing each board for squeaks until she reached the window. There was a small gap in the heavy velvet curtains. Trembling, she leaned forward and looked inside. The interior was warm, lit by a roaring fire that cast dancing shadows on the walls. Alistair stood in the centre of the room, water dripping from his greatcoat, his expression unguarded in a way she had never seen. He looked frantic, his usual iron composure shattered into 1,000 pieces. And he was not alone. Standing before him was a woman. She was older, perhaps 50, with severe features and greying hair pulled back in a tight bun. She wore plain, dark clothing, the attire of a commoner, yet Alistair looked at her with an intensity that burned. Clara watched, her breath hitched in her throat, as her husband reached out and took the woman's hands in his. He did not just hold them, he clung to them, his knuckles white with the force of his grip. "Please," Alistair was saying, his voice muffled by the glass but audible enough for Clara to hear the raw desperation in it. "You must help me. I cannot bear it any longer." The woman shook her head, her expression stern but not unkind. "I have told you, Your Grace, the risk is too great. The mixture is volatile." "I do not care about the risk," Alistair insisted, dropping to his knees. The proud Duke of Exmoor, who bowed to no one, was kneeling before this stranger in a dusty hunting lodge. "I will pay anything. I will give you whatever you ask. Just make it stop." He reached into his coat and pulled out a heavy leather pouch. The clink of coins was unmistakable as he pressed it into the woman's hands. She hesitated, then took it, nodding slowly. Clara felt the world tilt on its axis. She could not hear every word, but the scene before her painted a picture that confirmed her deepest, darkest insecurities. The secrecy, the late-night meeting, the desperation, the payment. It was an affair. It had to be. But it was not the affair of a man seeking pleasure with a young beauty. It was something deeper, something darker. This woman held a power over him that Clara could never hope to possess. Alistair, the man who would not even touch his wife's hand, was begging this woman, paying her, kneeling for her. The betrayal cut deeper than any knife. It wasn't just that he was unfaithful. It was that he was capable of passion, capable of need. Just not for her. She was nothing to him, less than nothing. She was an obstacle, a burden he returned to only out of obligation. Clara backed away from the window, a hand clamped over her mouth to stifle a sob that threatened to tear her apart. The rain mingled with the hot tears streaming down her face. She stumbled off the porch, nearly falling into the mud. She had to get away. She could not go back to that house, to that cold, empty bed, knowing that her husband poured his heart out to another in a hidden lodge while she withered in silence. She ran blindly back through the woods, the branches whipping against her face, leaving stinging scratches on her cheeks. By the time she reached the manor, her mind was made up. The resolve hardened in her chest, cold and brittle as ice. She would not be the pitiful wife waiting for crumbs of affection. She would not stay and watch him live a secret life while she played the role of the ignorant Duchess. She entered the house shivering violently, but not from the cold. She moved with a strange, detached efficiency, as if she were watching herself from a distance. She went to her room and stripped off her soaked cloak, but she did not change into dry clothes immediately. Instead, she went to the small jewelry box on her vanity. It contained the few pieces her mother had left her: a sapphire brooch, a string of pearls, a gold locket containing a miniature of her father. They were modest compared to the Sterling family jewels, but they were hers. They were her ticket to freedom. She sewed them into the lining of her bodice with shaking fingers, the needle piercing the fabric with a rhythmic precision. Then, she grabbed a small satchel and packed only the absolute essentials: a dry pair of stockings, a loaf of bread she had saved from her supper tray, and a small knife. She looked around the room that had been her prison for 2 years. The silk hangings, the polished furniture, the cold, empty space. There was nothing here she would miss. No warmth, no love, no memories worth keeping. She needed a plan. She could not simply leave. Alistair would come looking for her, not out of love, but out of duty and pride. A duke's wife does not simply walk away. No, she had to disappear. She had to make him believe she was gone forever. Clara left the room and walked through the silent house, down the grand staircase, and out the front doors. The storm was still raging, the river that cut through the estate swollen and violent. She walked toward the riverbank, the mud sucking at her boots, threatening to pull her down. Ideally, she would have left a note, but suicides were scandalous and accidents were tragic. Tragedy was better for Alistair's reputation. Even in her flight, she found herself protecting him. The habit of duty was hard to break. She reached the edge of the river. The water roared, black and churning, carrying debris downstream with terrifying speed. Clara took a deep breath, the cold air stinging her lungs. She unpinned the fine wool shawl from her shoulders, a blue one that Alistair had seen her wear a dozen times. She snagged it deliberately on a jagged branch that hung low over the water, letting the fabric tear and flutter in the wind. Then, she sat on the muddy bank and unlaced one of her boots. She pulled it off and wedged it deep into the mud near the water's edge, positioning it as if someone had slipped and lost their footing in a desperate struggle to climb back up. It looked convincing. A slip in the dark, a fall into the raging water, a body swept out to sea. She stood up, now wearing only one boot, the cold mud oozing through her stocking. It didn't matter. She had another pair in her bag, but she couldn't put them on yet. She had to limp away from the scene, stepping carefully on rocks and patches of grass to leave no trail leading away from the river. She walked for a mile in the freezing rain, her foot numb and bleeding, until she reached the old stone bridge that marked the boundary of the estate. Only then did she sit under the shelter of the bridge, shivering uncontrollably, to clean her foot as best she could, and put on the dry stockings and the spare pair of walking shoes she had packed. She looked back toward the manor one last time. The lights were distant now, barely visible through the rain, like dying stars. "Goodbye, Alistair," she whispered into the wind, her voice lost in the roar of the storm. "You are free of me now." She turned her back on her life as a duchess and began the long walk to the crossroads. The mail coach passed through there at 3 in the morning, headed north. She had enough coin in her pocket for a fare, providing she didn't look too much like a noblewoman. She pulled her hair down from its severe style, messing it up, and rubbed dirt onto her face and hands. She tore the lace from her cuffs. She was no longer Lady Clara Vance. She was just a woman, alone and desperate, lost in the storm. The walk to the crossroads took hours. Her body screamed for rest, her legs heavy as lead, but fear kept her moving. Fear that he might find her. Fear that she might falter and turn back. When she finally saw the dim lights of the coaching inn, she nearly collapsed with relief. The coach was delayed by the weather, the innkeeper told her gruffly when she stumbled inside, dripping wet. She paid him for a seat in the corner near the fire, keeping her head down, avoiding the gaze of the few drunken patrons. She looked like a ghost, pale and shivering, her eyes wide with shock. When the coach finally arrived, the driver was shouting at the horses, his voice struggling against the wind. Clara climbed inside, squeezing onto a bench between a snoring merchant and a woman with a basket of chickens. The smell of wet wool and unwashed bodies was overwhelming. A stark contrast to the lavender and beeswax of Exmoor Manor, but to Clara, it smelled like freedom. As the coach lurched forward, swaying violently in the mud, Clara closed her eyes. She touched her stomach instinctively, a gesture she didn't quite understand yet. She felt a strange hollowness, a grief for the life she might have had, for the husband she had wanted to love, but who had refused to let her in. She thought of the woman at the lodge, of Alistair's desperate face, of the money-changing hands. Whatever secret they shared, whatever bond they had, she was no longer an obstacle to it. She was dead to them. The coach rattled north, carrying her away from the only world she had ever known, into a future that was as dark and uncertain as the storm-swept night. She did not know where she would go, or how she would survive. She only knew that she could not stay in a house where she was a ghost in her own life. As the carriage wheels spun through the muck, distancing her further from Exmoor with every revolution, Clara Vance ceased to exist. In her place sat a woman with no name, no past, and a future as blank and terrifying as the empty road ahead. 3 months is a deceptive measure of time. To the happy, it is a fleeting season, a breath of summer wind that passes before one has barely tasted the warmth. To the grieving, it is an eternity, a slow march through a desolate landscape where every hour weighs as heavily as a stone. But to the fugitive, to the woman living a borrowed life under a borrowed name, 3 months is a tightrope walk over a chasm of anxiety where 1 foot wrong means a fall into ruin. In the small, windswept coastal village of Whitby, far to the north of the lush rolling hills of Exmoor, the woman known as Mrs. Brown sat by a narrow window, trying to catch the last of the fading daylight. The air here was different, sharp with salt and the smell of gutted fish, carrying a constant damp chill that seeped into the bones. It was a far cry from the lavender-scented corridors of the manor she had left behind, but Clara found a strange comfort in the harshness. Here, survival was the only currency that mattered. She pulled the thread through the rough linen of a fisherman's shirt, her fingers moving with a rhythm that had become her heartbeat. Mrs. Brown was a widow, or so she had told Mrs. Gable, the owner of the small seamstress shop that smelled perpetually of wet wool and starch. A widow whose husband had been lost at sea, leaving her with nothing but her skills with a needle. It was a lie close enough to the truth to pass inspection. Clara's husband wasn't dead, but he was lost to her, and she was certainly adrift. "You're squinting again, dear," Mrs. Gable called out from the back room, her voice raspy from years of inhaling fabric dust. "Don't ruin your eyes for a 6-penny shirt. The light's gone." Clara lowered the fabric, blinking against the sudden throb behind her temples. "I just wanted to finish this hem, Mrs. Gable. Mr. Henderson needs it for the morning tide." "Mr. Henderson can wait. His boat isn't going anywhere without the tide, and neither is his shirt." The older woman bustled into the room, wiping her hands on her apron. She looked at Clara with a mixture of maternal concern and employer's scrutiny. "You look pale, love. Paler than usual. And that's saying something for a girl who looks like she's made of porcelain." Clara forced a smile, though it felt brittle on her face. "I am fine, just a little tired. The weather has been turning." It wasn't just the weather. For the past few weeks, a strange lethargy had settled over her, a heaviness that made her limbs feel like lead. Her appetite, never robust, had vanished entirely, replaced by a roiling nausea that assaulted her every morning the moment her feet touched the cold floorboards of her rented room above the shop. She had attributed it to stress, to the constant gnawing fear that Alistair might have hired Bow Street runners to find his runaway wife, or perhaps to the poor quality of the food she could afford on her meagre wages. She stood up to fold the shirt, but the movement was too sudden. The room tilted violently to the left. The rows of fabric bolts on the shelves seemed to dissolve into a swirl of grey and black. The sound of the sea outside rushed in her ears, drowning out Mrs. Gable's voice. Clara reached out for the edge of the table to steady herself, but her fingers grasped only air. The floor rushed up to meet her, and the world went dark. When she opened her eyes, the smell of smelling salts was stinging her nose, sharp and acrid. She gasped, trying to push the hand away, and found herself lying on the small cot in the back room. Mrs. Gable was hovering over her, her face pinched with worry, and beside her stood a man Clara recognized as Dr. Thorne, the village physician. He was an ancient creature, smelling of tobacco and peppermint, with hands that were surprisingly gentle as he checked her pulse. "Easy now, Mrs. Brown," the doctor murmured, his voice a low rumble. "Don't try to sit up just yet. You took quite a tumble." Clara's hand flew to her throat. Panic, cold and sharp, pierced through the fog in her mind. Had she said anything while she was unconscious? Had she murmured the name Sterling? Had she asked for Alistair? I am sorry," she stammered, trying to rise. "I must have forgotten to eat. I will get back to work." "You will do no such thing," Mrs. Gable said firmly, pushing her back down. "Not until the doctor says so." "Doctor?" Thorne sat back on his stool, peering at her over the rim of his spectacles. His gaze was shrewd, assessing. "It is not merely a lack of food, though you could certainly do with a few hearty meals, young woman. Tell me, how long has it been since your courses last arrived?" The question hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. Clara froze. She stared at the cracked ceiling, her mind racing to calculate dates, days, weeks. In the chaos of her flight, the terror of the storm, and the struggle to establish this new, fragile life, she hadn't kept track. She hadn't thought. Clara's voice failed her. 2 months. 3. Dr. Thorne prompted gently. 3, she whispered, the realization crashing over her like an icy wave. Perhaps nearly 4. The doctor nodded, as if this confirmed a suspicion he had held since walking in. "And the sickness in the mornings? The fatigue?" "Yes." "Congratulations, Mrs. Brown," Dr. Thorne said, though his tone was grave, acknowledging the lack of a ring on her finger and the story of the dead husband. "You are with child." The room went silent. Mrs. Gable let out a soft gasp and covered her mouth, her eyes wide, but Clara didn't hear her. She couldn't hear anything over the sudden, deafening pounding of her own heart. A child. Alistair's child. Her hand drifted instinctively to her stomach, flattened beneath the coarse wool of her dress. There was life there, a spark of the man she had left behind, growing inside her. A tiny, fragile connection to Exmoor that she could not sever, no matter how far she ran. Tears pricked her eyes, hot and overwhelming. This was not a blessing. It was a catastrophe. How could she raise a child in a room above a dress shop? How could she feed a baby on the pennies she earned stitching shirts for fishermen? But more than the poverty, the terror that gripped her was the lineage. This child was not just any baby. This child was the heir to the Duchy of Exmoor. This child belonged to the Sterling bloodline. If Alistair knew, the thought made her blood run cold. If Alistair knew she was alive and carrying his heir, he would not leave her be. He would come for the child. He would take the baby to raise in that cold, silent mausoleum of a house, and he would cast her aside again, or worse, lock her away to ensure she never embarrassed him again. Or perhaps he would think the child wasn't his. He had believed she was dead for 3 months. If she reappeared now, pregnant, would he accuse her of carrying another man's bastard? The cruelty of such a rejection would be more than she could bear. "Thank you, Doctor," Clara said, her voice hollow. "Thank you for telling me." The next few days were a blur of internal torment. Mrs. Gable, bless her heart, had been kind, offering extra broth and lighter duties, assuming Clara was grieving the fact that her husband would never see the babe. Clara let her believe it. The truth was far too dangerous to share. She lay awake at night, listening to the wind rattle the window pane, her hands resting protectively over her womb. She had left Exmoor to free Alistair, to let him be with the woman he loved, the woman she had seen him begging in the lodge. She had sacrificed her life so he could have his happiness. But now she carried a piece of him. Did she have the right to keep this child from its father? Did she have the right to deny her child its birthright? But what if Alistair was happy? What if he had already moved on? If he had married the woman from the lodge, Mrs. Halloway, or if he was simply relieved to be free of his dull, unwanted wife, her return would destroy everything. She couldn't just walk back in. She couldn't risk revealing herself only to be rejected again, this time with an innocent life caught in the crossfire. She needed to know. She needed to see him, not to speak to him, not to reveal herself, but to observe. She needed to know if he was the grieving widower or the liberated man. She needed to know if Exmoor was a safe place for her child, or if it was the lion's den. If she walked up to the great doors and announced herself now, round with his child and armed with nothing but the truth, she would be placing that truth into Roderick's hands as much as Alistair's. A cousin who smelled weakness could turn a living duchess into a scandal, and a fragile heir into a bargaining chip. She needed proof first. She needed to know whose house she would be walking back into. Her husband's, or her enemy's. The decision hardened in her chest like steel. She would go back, not as the Duchess, but as a ghost. She would go to the village near the estate, listen to the gossip, see the state of the manor. If he was happy, she would vanish again, go to France, and raise the child in secret. But if there was something else... "I have to go away for a few days, Mrs. Gable," Clara announced one morning, packing her meagre satchel. "I have a cousin in the south. I must see if she can help me with the babe." Mrs. Gable looked doubtful, but pressed a few coins into Clara's hand. "You be careful, love. The roads aren't safe for a woman alone, let alone one in your condition." The journey back to Devon was a nightmare of discomfort. The mail coaches were crowded, the roads were rutted from the autumn rains, and every jolt sent a wave of nausea rolling through Clara's stomach. She wore the darkest clothes she had, a heavy black bonnet with a thick veil that obscured her features. She looked like exactly what she was pretending to be, a grieving widow, invisible to the world. As the landscape began to change, shifting from the harsh northern coast to the rolling, verdant hills of the West Country, Clara's anxiety spiked. Every mile brought her closer to him. Every landmark was a memory. There was the inn where they had stopped on their wedding journey, a silent, awkward affair. There was the crossroads that led to the market town. She arrived in the village of Oakhaven, the settlement closest to Exmoor Manor, just as the sun was setting behind the hills, painting the sky in bruises of purple and red. The village felt different than she remembered. It was quieter, the atmosphere subdued. Shutters were closed tight against the evening chill. Clara kept her head down as she entered the Silent Swan, the local inn. It was a place where the estate workers often gathered for a pint after a long day. If there was news to be had, it would be here. She paid for a small room in the attic and ordered a pot of tea, sitting in the darkest corner of the taproom, her veil still lowered. The room was thick with smoke and the smell of roasted meat. 2 men were sitting at the table next to hers, their voices low but carrying in the stillness. She recognized one of them, Thomas, the undergardener at the manor. He looked older, tired. "It's not right," Thomas was saying, shaking his head into his tankard. "The west fields are gone to weed. He won't give the order to harvest, says it doesn't matter." "He's mad, I tell you," the other man, a blacksmith named Pike, grunted. "Mad with grief or guilt. They say he hasn't left the ground since the funeral, just walks the perimeter like a ghost." Clara's hand trembled as she lifted her teacup. "Mad with grief? Alistair." "It's the screaming that gets me," Thomas whispered, leaning in closer. "The maids, they say he screams at night, howls like a wounded animal, calls her name. They say he sits by that empty grave for hours, rain or shine, won't let anyone touch her things. The house is like a tomb, Pike. We're all terrified he's going to dismiss the lot of us and let the place rot." "And the cousin?" Pike asked. Lord Roderick. Oh, he's there all right. Thomas spat on the floor, his expression sour, strutting about like he owns the place already, giving orders, changing the accounts. The Duke doesn't even notice. Roderick is pouring him wine and telling him to rest, and the Duke just fades away. It's unnatural. The man was iron, and now he's rust. Clara felt the blood drain from her face. This was not the narrative she had expected. She had expected a man relieved, perhaps a man quietly moving on with his mistress. She had not expected a man destroyed. He screams her name. He visits the grave. A confusing mixture of hope and horror swirled in her chest. Why would he grieve so violently for a wife he ignored? Unless it was guilt that he had driven her to it. He believes he killed her, Thomas continued, his voice dropping to a whisper that Clara had to strain to hear. I heard him once, when I was pruning the roses near the library window. He was talking to himself, saying he should have told her, saying he sent her away to keep her safe and instead sent her to the river. Sent her away to keep her safe? The words hit Clara with the force of a physical blow. The scene in the hunting lodge replayed in her mind, but the context shifted violently. The risk is too great. The mixture is volatile. I will pay anything. Make it stop. Was it possible? Was it possible she had misunderstood everything? The cousin is up to something, Pike muttered. I don't like the look of him. If the Duke dies of a broken heart, Roderick gets it all. The title, the land, the money. And he's helping the Duke along that path, if you ask me, Thomas agreed darkly. Keeping him in the dark, feeding his misery. Clara sat back, her mind racing. Alistair wasn't happy. He wasn't free. He was dying. He was wasting away, consumed by a grief she had caused, while his cousin circled like a vulture waiting for the carcass. And amidst it all, there was this baffling thread that he had been trying to protect her. She looked down at her stomach. She had come here to see if it was safe to reveal her child. What she had found was a house on the brink of collapse and a husband who was apparently losing his mind. She could not simply turn around and leave now. She couldn't raise this child knowing its father died of grief, or something worse, because of a lie she created. But she couldn't just walk up to the front door. If Roderick was truly taking over, he was dangerous. If Alistair was truly mad, he might not believe her, or the shock might kill him, and she was officially dead. To return now would be a scandal that would rock the peerage, and she had no proof of who she was or why she had left, other than her own word against a tragedy everyone had accepted. She needed to see him. She needed to see him with her own eyes, without him seeing her. She needed to gauge the truth of Thomas's words before she made a move that could endanger her unborn child. Clara stood up, leaving her tea untouched. She pulled her cloak tighter around her, hiding the slight swell of her belly. She would not go to the manor tonight. The moon was too bright, and the risk of being seen by the gatekeepers was too high. But tomorrow she would find a way in. She knew the old servants' paths better than anyone. She knew the loose stone in the garden wall. She climbed the stairs to her attic room, the wooden steps creaking under her weight. She lay down on the lumpy straw mattress, but sleep was impossible. The image of Alistair, strong, cold, invincible Alistair, screaming in the night, haunted her. I am here, Alistair, she whispered into the darkness of the room, her hand resting on her stomach. I am here, and I am listening. Outside, the wind picked up, howling through the village of Oakhaven, carrying with it the scent of rain and the heavy, oppressive atmosphere of Exmoor. The silence of her death had been broken by the rumours of his madness, and now the ghost was coming home to haunt the living, armed with a secret that could save the dynasty or destroy it completely. The game had changed. It was no longer about escape, it was about rescue. The shadows of Exmoor did not fall like ordinary darkness. They rose from the earth like a tide, swallowing the ancient trees and the jagged lines of the manor house in a suffocating embrace of grey and black. For Clara, who had once walked these grounds as the mistress of the estate, the familiar landscape had twisted into something alien and threatening. She moved through the perimeter woods with the caution of a hunted animal, her black boots sinking silently into the damp layers of decaying leaves. The heavy veil of her mourning bonnet obscured her vision, forcing her to rely on memory and instinct to navigate the tangled roots that threatened to trip her with every step. It had been 3 days since she arrived in Oakhaven, 3 days of listening to whispers in the tavern and watching the distant, unmoving silhouette of the manor from the ridge. The stories of the mad Duke had grown more detailed and more disturbing with each passing hour. They spoke of a man who had banished sunlight from his halls, who dismissed servants for the crime of laughing, and who spent his nights wandering the grounds like a tormented spirit. Clara told herself she was only here for the jewels, the sapphire brooch and the pearls she had left behind in the hidden compartment of her vanity. They were her birthright, the only means she had to secure a future for the child growing within her. But as she slipped through the rusted iron gate of the servants' entrance, her heart was not pounding with the thrill of theft, but with a terrifying, hollow dread. The estate was silent, but it was not the peaceful silence of sleep. It was the silence of a held breath, heavy with tension. The gardens, once manicured to geometric perfection, were wild and overgrown. Rose bushes had turned into thorny thickets, clawing at the stone benches, and the gravel paths were choked with weeds. It was as if the land itself was mourning, mirroring the decay of the man who ruled it. Clara pulled her dark cloak tighter around her, shielding the slight swell of her abdomen from the biting wind. She was an intruder in her own home, a ghost returning to haunt the wreckage of her past life. She skirted the edge of the east wing, aiming for the terrace doors that she knew had a faulty latch, a defect Alistair had promised to fix a dozen times, but never did. But as she neared the corner of the house, a sound stopped her dead in her tracks. It was a sound so raw, so stripped of humanity, that it made the hair on her arms stand up. It was a sob, but not the weeping of a child or the soft crying of a woman. It was the guttural tearing sound of a man breaking apart, a sound dredged up from the very bottom of a soul. Clara froze, pressing herself against the rough stone of the garden wall. The sound was coming from the north, from the direction of the family mausoleum. Logic screamed at her to run, to seize this opportunity, while the master of the house was distracted to slip inside and retrieve her fortune. But her feet refused to move. The tether that bound her to Alistair Sterling, a tether she thought she had severed with a knife and a muddy boot 3 months ago, pulled at her with irresistible force. She crept toward the sound, moving like a shadow among shadows. The mausoleum rose from the mist like a white bone, a grand structure of marble and granite where generations of Sterlings lay in cold repose. The iron gates of the crypt were open, and the flickering light of a lantern spilled out onto the grass, illuminating the figure of a man kneeling in the dirt. Clara stifled a gasp, her hand flying to her mouth beneath the veil. It was Alistair. But it was not the Alistair she remembered. The man she had left was a towering figure of ice and iron, impeccably groomed, his posture rigid with arrogant control. The man before her was a ruin. He had lost a shocking amount of weight. His coat hung loosely on his broad frame, and his black hair, usually slicked back, was wild and matted, as if he had been tearing at it with his hands. He was unshaven, a dark shadow of stubble covering his jaw, highlighting the gaunt hollows of his cheeks. He was kneeling not on the stone steps, but in the mud, directly in front of a fresh slab of marble that bore her name. Clara Vance Sterling, Duchess of Exmoor, beloved wife, taken by the water. The sight of her own grave was a physical blow, a surreal horror that made the world spin. But the sight of Alistair was worse. He was clutching the cold stone with both hands, his forehead resting against the marble, his body shaking with violent tremors that had nothing to do with the cold. "I am sorry," he choked out, the words fractured by his sobbing. "I am so sorry, Clara. I am so sorry." Clara watched, paralyzed. This was the man who had barely looked at her for 2 years. This was the husband who had treated her with the polite indifference one might show a piece of furniture. "I thought I was saving you," Alistair whispered to the stone, his voice dropping to a jagged murmur that carried on the wind. "God help me. I thought I was strong enough to bear it alone. I thought if I pushed you away." If I made you hate me, you wouldn't have to watch me rot. Clara's breath hitched. Watch him rot? What was he talking about? Alistair pulled back from the stone, his face illuminated by the lantern light. His eyes, those piercing blue eyes that had always seemed so cold, were red-rimmed and swimming with a torture she couldn't comprehend. He looked at the grave as if he expected it to answer him. You saw her, he said, his voice taking on a desperate, pleading edge. That night, at the lodge. I know you must have seen us. Roderick told me. He told me you were wandering the grounds that night. You must have seen me with Mrs. Halloway. Clara's heart hammered against her ribs. He knew. I saw the way you looked at me those last months, Alistair continued, wiping a trembling hand across his face. You thought I was betraying you. You thought I was buying a mistress with the coin I gave her. He let out a bitter, strangled laugh that sounded more like a bark of pain. A mistress. God, if only it had been something so simple. If only I were just a lecherous fool. But I couldn't tell you the truth. I couldn't tell you that Mrs. Halloway wasn't a lover, but a healer. The only one who knew how to mix the belladonna and the foxglove to stop the shaking. He held up his hands, staring at them. Even in the dim light, Clara could see them vibrating with a fine, uncontrollable tremor. The Sterling curse, he spat the words out. That's what my father called it. The madness in the blood. The tremors that start in the hands and end in the mind. I watched him die of it, Clara. I watched him forget my mother's name. I watched him scream at invisible demons until his heart gave out. And when my hands started to shake 6 months into our marriage, when the blindness started to take the edges of my vision, I knew. Clara felt the ground beneath her shift, the cold indifference, the separate bedrooms, the long hours locked in his study, the refusal to touch her. It wasn't hatred. It wasn't disgust. I couldn't sentence you to that, Alistair wept, his voice breaking again. I couldn't let you be the nursemaid to a madman. I wanted you to leave. I wanted you to hate me enough to go back to your family, to find a lover, to find happiness far away from this cursed house. I was trying to drive you away to save you. He slammed his fist against the earth, mud splattering his coat. But I killed you instead, he screamed, the sound echoing off the mausoleum walls, raw and terrifying. I drove you into the river. I made you feel so unloved, so worthless, that you threw yourself into the dark water rather than spend another night under my roof. It wasn't the river that killed you, Clara. It was me. It was my silence. It was my cowardice. Clara pressed her hand over her mouth so hard, her knuckles turned white. Tears were streaming down her face, hot and fast, soaking into the fabric of her veil. The realization hit her with the force of a physical blow, shattering the narrative she had built for the last 3 months. She had crafted a story of a victim escaping a tyrant. She had justified her flight, her deception, her silence, with the certainty that he did not care. But he cared. He cared so much that he had dismantled his own happiness to protect hers. He had broken his own heart daily, treating her with ice while burning with love, solely to spare her the pain of watching him succumb to a hereditary madness. And now, Alistair's voice dropped to a whisper, filled with a terrifying resignation. Now Roderick tells me the end is coming faster. The darkness is closing in, Clara. I lose hours of the day. I wake up and I don't know where I am. The medicine Mrs. Halloway gave me, it doesn't work anymore. Roderick says she was a fraud, that her potions made me worse. Perhaps he is right. Perhaps I deserve this acceleration. It is my penance. He leaned forward, resting his forehead against the cold marble of her name again. I love you, he whispered, the confession hanging in the damp air like a prayer. I have loved you since the day you walked into the church, looking so terrified and so beautiful. I loved your quiet strength. I loved the way you read in the library when you thought I wasn't watching. I loved you enough to let you go. And I will love you until the madness takes the last of my mind. I only hope that where you are, there is no cold. I hope you are warm, Clara. I hope you are safe. Clara slumped against the wall, her legs giving way. She slid down into the damp grass, heedless of the mud staining her dress. The world had turned upside down. Mrs. Halloway wasn't a mistress. She was a desperate attempt at a cure. The distance wasn't rejection. It was protection. And Alistair wasn't a villain. He was a martyr of his own making, destroying himself to save her from a fate he thought was inevitable. But there was something else, something sharper and more dangerous than the tragedy of their misunderstanding. Roderick. Alistair's words replayed in her mind, sharp and alarming. Roderick tells me the end is coming faster. Roderick says she was a fraud. Roderick says her potions made me worse. Clara's mind, sharpened by months of survival, latched onto these details. Alistair had tremors. Alistair feared a hereditary madness. But he had been managing it, secretly, with Mrs. Halloway's help until when? Until Roderick arrived. She remembered the look in Roderick's eyes at the wedding, calculating, cold, envious. She remembered the rumours in the village, that Roderick was taking control, isolating the Duke, managing the accounts. And now Alistair was deteriorating rapidly. He was losing time. He was hallucinating. These weren't necessarily symptoms of a genetic disease. They were symptoms of poisoning. The thought chilled her more than the grave dirt beneath her fingers. If Alistair was right, he was dying of a genetic curse. But if Alistair was wrong, if the madness was being induced, then he wasn't just dying. He was being murdered. She looked back at the figure of her husband. He was broken, weeping, believing himself to be the architect of her death. If she revealed herself now, walked into that light, the shock might kill him. His heart was already strained, his mind fragile. And if Roderick was truly poisoning him, revealing herself would only put a target on her back, and on the back of the unborn heir she carried. Roderick wouldn't hesitate to finish the job if the rightful Duchess returned with a child who would displace him from the line of succession. She couldn't go to him. Not yet. She needed to be sure. She needed proof. She needed to know if the Sterling curse was real, or if it was a slow-acting venom poured from a cousin's hand. Alistair let out another sob, a sound of pure exhaustion, and slumped sideways against the grave, his energy spent. He looked like a man ready to lie down in the dirt and never get up. "I will join you soon, my love," he murmured, closing his eyes, his hand still resting on the letters of her name. "Roderick says I should sign the regency papers tomorrow. He says I am no longer fit. Once that is done, once the duty is past, I can finally rest." The regency papers. The urgency pierced through Clara's grief like a needle. If Alistair signed those papers, Roderick would have legal control over the duchy, the finances, and Alistair's own person. He could lock Alistair away in an asylum and let him rot while he spent the Sterling fortune. She had to stop him. But she couldn't stop him as Clara Vance, the dead wife. She had to stop him as something else, something unseen, something that could move through walls and uncover secrets. Clara wiped the tears from her face with the back of her gloved hand. The resolve that had driven her to escape 3 months ago surged back, but this time it was fueled by a fierce, protective fire. She wasn't running away anymore. She was digging in. She watched as Alistair slowly, painfully pulled himself to his feet. He swayed dangerously, catching himself on the wrought iron gate of the crypt. He looked back at the grave one last time, whispered a final goodnight to the empty earth, and turned to walk back toward the looming shadow of the manor. He walked like an old man, shuffling and heavy. Clara waited until he was swallowed by the darkness of the garden path. Then she stood up. She didn't look at the grave, her grave. It meant nothing to her now. It was a monument to a lie. She turned her gaze toward the manor house, specifically toward the dark windows of the east wing. It had been shut up for years, used only for storage. No servants went there. No fires were lit there. It was a dusty, forgotten corner of the house. Perfect. She would not steal the jewels and run to France. She would not leave him to die in the dark, believing he had killed her. She would become the ghost he believed her to be. She would haunt these halls. She would watch Roderick. She would find the poison. And she would save the man who had tried to save her. Clara Vance adjusted her veil, wrapping the shadows around her like armor. She was no longer the victim. She was the Duchess of Exmoor, and she was going to war for her husband and her child. She moved away from the mausoleum, not toward the exit gate, but toward the house. She knew a way in through the old cellar doors that led to the east wing, a passage the servants had forgotten a generation ago. As she slipped into the black maw of the cellar, the heavy oak doors closing behind her with a soft thud, the weeping in the graveyard ceased, replaced by the scratching of rats in the walls. But for the first time in years, the house was not entirely empty. Its mistress had returned, and she was watching from the shadows. The haunting of Exmoor Manor had truly begun. The east wing of Exmoor Manor had always unnerved the servants, even in the years when the household bustled with life and purpose. It was the oldest part of the estate, built in the Tudor period, with low ceilings crossed by dark beams and windows too narrow to let in proper light. After the late Duke's death, Alistair had ordered it closed entirely, the furniture draped in white sheets, the rooms locked and forgotten. It was a wing meant for ghosts, and now it had one. Clara stood in the centre of what had once been a guest chamber, her breath misting in the cold air. Dust motes danced in the thin beam of moonlight that struggled through the grimy window pane. The room smelled of damp and decay, the wallpaper peeling in long strips like dead skin. A four-poster bed dominated the space, its curtains grey with dust, and a wardrobe stood sentinel in the corner, its mirror cracked down the middle. It was not comfort, but it was shelter. More importantly, it was invisible. She had entered the manor through the old servants' passage, a network of narrow corridors that ran behind the walls, designed so that maids and footmen could move unseen while tending to their duties. Clara knew these passages better than anyone. She had explored them during the long, lonely months of her marriage, seeking solace in the hidden arteries of the house when the grand rooms became too suffocating. Now, those same passages were her lifeline. She moved carefully, her boots silent on the stone floors, her dark cloak blending into the shadows. The house was different at night. The silence was not peaceful, but oppressive, thick with tension. She could hear the distant murmur of voices from the main wing, the creak of floorboards, the occasional slam of a door. Life continued in Exmoor Manor, but it was a fractured, troubled life, like a body dying slowly from within. Clara had been living in the east wing for 2 days now, 2 days of holding her breath every time footsteps passed too close to her hiding place. 2 days of rationing the stale bread she had brought from the village and melting snow from the windowsill for water. But she could not survive on snow and crumbs. She was carrying a child. The nausea that plagued her mornings was becoming more insistent, and the dizziness that had caused her to faint in Whitby threatened to return if she did not eat properly. Tonight, she would have to venture deeper into the house. She would have to risk the kitchens. The clock in the main hall chimed 2 in the morning, its echoes reverberating through the empty corridors. Clara waited another 10 minutes, listening intently for any signs of movement before slipping out of her chamber. She moved through the servants' passage, her fingers trailing along the rough brick walls to guide her in the darkness. The passage opened into a narrow staircase that descended into the bowels of the manor, where the kitchens and larders lay. The kitchen was cavernous and cold, the great hearth reduced to embers that cast a faint orange glow. Copper pots hung from hooks on the walls, their surfaces tarnished and dull. Clara's stomach twisted with hunger as she approached the larder. The door was ajar, thank God. She pushed it open, wincing at the faint creak of the hinges. Inside, shelves lined the walls, stocked with provisions that seemed excessive for a household in mourning. Wheels of cheese, jars of preserves, sacks of flour, and baskets of apples. Clara's hands trembled as she reached for a loaf of bread, wrapped in cloth. She took 2 apples as well, their skins bruised but edible, and filled a small flask with water from the pitcher on the shelf. She worked quickly, her ears straining for any sound of approach. As she turned to leave, a voice froze her in place. "Did you hear something?" Clara's heart stopped. The voice was coming from the hallway just beyond the kitchen. She pressed herself against the wall, clutching the stolen food to her chest. "You're imagining things," another voice replied, this one deeper, tinged with irritation. Clara recognized it instantly. Roderick Sterling, Alistair's cousin. The house is old. It creaks. Go back to bed. I swear I heard footsteps, my lord, the first voice insisted. It was one of the footmen, young and nervous. Then perhaps it's the Duchess's ghost come to haunt us, Roderick said with a cold laugh. She always did have a talent for being inconvenient. Now go. I have business to attend to. Clara held her breath as the footman's footsteps retreated. But Roderick's did not. Instead, they entered the kitchen. She could see his shadow, tall and angular, cast by the dying embers. He moved to the table and set down a small leather case. Clara watched through the crack in the larder door as he opened it, revealing several glass vials filled with dark liquid. Perfect, Roderick muttered to himself, holding one of the vials up to the light. Just a few more doses, and the Duke will be too far gone to object. The doctors will declare him unfit, and the title will pass to me, as it always should have. Clara's blood turned to ice. Poison. He was poisoning Alistair. Roderick corked the vial and placed it back in the case, snapping it shut. He left the kitchen, whistling a tuneless melody that echoed down the hallway. Clara waited until she could no longer hear him before allowing herself to breathe. Her hands were shaking so violently that she nearly dropped the bread. She needed proof. She needed to understand what was happening to Alistair. And she needed evidence that would damn Roderick beyond question. The following night, Clara made her way to Alistair's study. It was a reckless decision, but desperation had made her bold. The study was in the main wing, far from the safety of the east, and it was a room Alistair had always kept locked. But Clara had watched the housekeeper, Mrs. Pembroke, hide a spare key beneath a loose tile in the hallway years ago. If it was still there, she might have a chance. The tile was exactly where she remembered. Clara pried it up with her fingernails, her breath coming in short, anxious gasps. The key was there, cold and heavy in her palm. She moved to the study door and inserted the key into the lock. It turned with a soft click that sounded deafening in the silence. The study was exactly as she remembered it. Dark wood panelling, shelves crammed with ledgers and legal documents, and a massive desk that dominated the room. A fire had been lit earlier, its embers still glowing faintly. Clara moved to the desk and began to search, her fingers rifling through papers and opening drawers. In the bottom drawer, she found it. A leather-bound journal, its cover worn and stained. She opened it, angling the pages toward the firelight. The entries were written in Alistair's hand, but the script was uneven, the letters shaky and difficult to read. They were dated, starting from 2 years ago, just months after their marriage. March 15th, 1821. The tremors have begun again. Worse this time. I can barely hold a pen. Mrs. Halloway believes the belladonna mixture may help, but the risk of toxicity is high. I cannot tell Clara. I will not burden her with this curse. Clara's throat tightened. She turned the pages, reading entry after entry that detailed his symptoms. The tremors, the headaches, the moments of confusion, and always, always, the refusal to let her know. But as she read further, she noticed a pattern. The worst episodes, the ones where he could barely function, were always preceded by a specific note. Roderick insists I take the tonic he has prepared. He says it will help me sleep. Dined with Roderick. He served an excellent wine. I felt unwell shortly after. Roderick brought me a remedy from London. The shaking intensified within hours. Clara's hands trembled as she closed the journal. Roderick was not just waiting for Alistair to die. He was hastening it. She needed to compare these symptoms with something, anything that could confirm her suspicions. She left the study and made her way to the library. The medical texts were kept on the upper shelves, dusty and neglected. Clara pulled down a volume on toxicology and another on herbal remedies, spreading them on the floor. She read by the light of a single candle, cross-referencing Alistair's symptoms with the descriptions in the books. Tremors, confusion, blurred vision, nausea, all consistent with gradual poisoning. Arsenic, perhaps, or a combination of belladonna and something more insidious? Clara sat back, her heart pounding. She had the answer. But what could she do with it? She was supposed to be dead. If she revealed herself now, Roderick would deny everything, and without proof, without witnesses, it would be her word against his. She needed more. She needed to catch him in the act. As she returned the books to their shelves, a floorboard creaked behind her. Clara spun around, her heart leaping into her throat. But the library was empty. Or so it seemed. She had left traces, the moved books. The journal returned slightly out of place. Small signs that would make Alistair doubt his sanity, make Roderick more confident in his control. Clara slipped back into the servants' passage, clutching the stolen food to her chest. She was no longer just hiding. She was hunting. The line between sanity and madness is thinner than most people realize. For Alistair Sterling, Duke of Exmoor, that line had become so blurred that he could no longer tell which side of it he stood on. The tremors in his hands had worsened, spreading up his arms like frost creeping across glass, and the headaches that plagued him left him bedridden for hours at a time. But worse than the physical symptoms was the growing certainty that he was losing his mind. It started with small things. A book left open on the desk in his study when he was certain he had closed it the night before. The faint scent of lavender in the hallway outside his chamber. A perfume he had not smelled since Clara's death. The sensation of being watched, of eyes following him as he moved through the empty corridors of the manor. At first, he dismissed these occurrences as tricks of exhaustion, the byproducts of grief and illness. But they continued, growing more frequent and more impossible to ignore. One morning, Alistair woke to find a white handkerchief on his pillow, embroidered with the initials C.V. Clara Vance. It was hers. He recognized it immediately, the delicate stitching done by her own hand. But how had it gotten there? He had burned all of her belongings after the funeral, unable to bear the sight of them. Or had he? His memory of those dark weeks was fractured, full of gaps and shadows. He clutched the handkerchief in his trembling hands, his heart pounding. "Clara," he whispered to the empty room. "Are you here? Are you haunting me?" The silence offered no answer. Roderick found him like that an hour later, still sitting on the edge of his bed, staring at the scrap of fabric as though it were a holy relic. "Cousin," Roderick said, his voice smooth and concerned as he entered the chamber without knocking. "You look dreadful. Have you slept at all?" Alistair looked up, his eyes bloodshot and hollow. "I found this," he said, holding out the handkerchief. "It was on my pillow." Roderick took it, examining it with a furrowed brow. "This is Clara's," he said slowly. "But Alistair, you packed away her things months ago. Perhaps you took it out and forgot. The illness affects your memory. You know that." "I did not take it out," Alistair insisted, his voice rising with desperation. "I burned everything. I could not stand to see her things. Someone put it there." Roderick's expression shifted to one of pity, the kind reserved for the mad and the dying. "Who would do such a thing? The servants adored Clara. They would never torment you with reminders of her." He placed a hand on Alistair's shoulder, his grip firm. "You are unwell, cousin. The grief, the illness, they are playing tricks on your mind. You must rest. Let me help you." He poured a glass from the decanter on the bedside table, a tonic of dark amber liquid that Roderick claimed was a restorative from a physician in London. "Drink this. It will calm your nerves." Alistair hesitated, staring at the glass. Lately, these tonics seemed to make him worse, not better. But Roderick was his family, his only living relative. Surely he would not harm him. Alistair took the glass and drank, the liquid bitter on his tongue. Within the hour, the tremors were so violent that he could not hold a pen. By evening, he was delirious, seeing shadows move in the corners of his vision and hearing whispers that made no sense. Roderick stayed by his side, his expression grave, and sent for the physician. When the doctor arrived, Roderick spoke to him in hushed tones in the hallway, out of Alistair's hearing. "He is deteriorating rapidly," Roderick said, shaking his head. "I fear the Sterling curse is taking him the same way it took his father. He speaks of ghosts. He believes his dead wife is haunting him. This morning, he claimed to have found one of her belongings, though I saw nothing. The doctor nodded solemnly. Delusions are common in the advanced stages of such afflictions. If he continues to decline, we may need to consider whether he is fit to manage the estate. Roderick's expression was appropriately sorrowful. I had feared as much. I will do whatever is necessary to protect the family name. Hidden in the servants' passage behind the wall, Clara pressed her hand over her mouth to stifle the rage that threatened to erupt. She had been watching from the shadows, a ghost in truth, and she had seen everything. The handkerchief had been hers, yes, but she had not left it on Alistair's pillow. She had dropped it in the hallway 2 nights ago while moving through the house, a careless mistake born of exhaustion. Someone must have found it and placed it there deliberately. Roderick. It had to be Roderick. He was not just poisoning Alistair's body, he was poisoning his mind, using Clara's memory as a weapon to drive him into madness. Every strange occurrence, every inexplicable sign, Roderick twisted into proof that Alistair was losing his sanity. And the tonics, the wine, the remedies Roderick provided, they were the true source of Alistair's suffering. Clara had to act. She could not simply observe any longer. She needed proof, tangible evidence that would expose Roderick's crimes beyond any doubt. And she knew where to find it. That night, when the house was silent and the servants had retired to their quarters, Clara slipped into Roderick's chamber. He was not there. She had watched him leave for the village an hour earlier, likely to procure more poison from whatever source he had cultivated. The room was immaculate, furnished with dark mahogany and heavy velvet drapes. A travelling trunk sat at the foot of the bed, its lock simple enough to pick with a hairpin. Inside, she found what she was looking for, a small wooden case lined with velvet, containing 6 glass vials. Each was labelled in Roderick's precise handwriting. Restorative tonic, sleep draught, nerve remedy. Clara's hands shook as she held one of the vials up to the moonlight. The liquid inside was dark, almost black, and had a faint, acrid smell when she carefully uncorked it. This was the poison. She was certain of it. But certainty was not proof. She needed someone with knowledge of toxins to confirm it. Someone who could testify if necessary. The old apothecary in Oakhaven. Mr. Finch. He had known her father, had supplied medicines to the Vance household for years. If anyone could identify what Roderick was using, it was him. Clara took 2 of the vials, reasoning that Roderick would not notice their absence immediately if she left the others. She wrapped them carefully in cloth and tucked them into the pocket of her cloak. Leaving the chamber exactly as she had found it, she made her way back to the servants' passage and out of the manor. The walk to the village was treacherous in the darkness. The roads were muddy from recent rains, and the woods were full of sounds that made her jump. Every snap of a branch, every rustle of leaves, felt like a threat. But she pressed on, driven by the knowledge that Alistair's life depended on her success. Mr. Finch's shop was dark. The windows shuttered for the night. Clara knocked softly on the side door, the entrance the apothecary used for his private residence above the shop. She knocked again, harder this time, and finally heard the shuffle of footsteps. The door opened a crack, revealing a wizened face and suspicious eyes. "Who is it? We are closed." "Mr. Finch," Clara said, lowering her veil so he could see her face in the moonlight. "It is Clara Vance. I need your help." The old man's eyes widened in shock. "Lady Clara, but you are... They said you were dead." "I know what they said," Clara replied urgently, "and I will explain everything, but not here. Please let me in. It is a matter of life and death." Finch hesitated, then opened the door wider, ushering her inside. The room was small and cluttered, smelling of dried herbs and old parchment. He lit a candle, his hands shaking slightly as he studied her face. "You look half-starved," he said finally. "And you are carrying a child." Clara's hand went instinctively to her stomach. "Yes, but that is not why I am here." She pulled the vials from her pocket and set them on the table. "I need you to tell me what is in these. I believe they contain poison." Finch picked up one of the vials, holding it close to the candle flame. He uncorked it and sniffed, his expression darkening. "Where did you get this?" "From Roderick Sterling," Clara said. He has been giving them to the Duke, claiming they are remedies, but I believe he is poisoning Alistair slowly to make him appear mad and unfit to hold the title. Finch set down the vial and moved to a shelf, pulling down several glass bottles and a set of small dishes. "This will take time," he said, "but I will test it. If what you say is true, this is a grave matter indeed." Clara watched as he worked, adding drops of the tonic to various reagents and observing the reactions. Some turned cloudy, others changed colour. Finch's frown deepened with each test. Finally he straightened, his expression grim. "Arsenic," he said, "and belladonna, a diabolical combination. The arsenic causes the physical symptoms, the tremors, the weakness. The belladonna causes the mental confusion, the hallucinations. Together they mimic a degenerative illness while slowly killing the victim. Whoever prepared this knew exactly what they were doing." Clara felt a cold fury settle over her. "Can you write this down? Your findings? Will you testify if needed?" "I will," Finch said solemnly. "But Lady Clara, if you confront Lord Roderick with this, he will be dangerous. A man who poisons his own cousin will not hesitate to harm a woman, even one carrying a child." "I know," Clara said, "but I cannot let Alistair die, and I cannot let Roderick steal what is not his." She left the apothecary's shop with Finch's written analysis tucked safely in her bodice, beside her mother's jewels. The vials were now evidence, sealed and labelled. She had what she needed. But the hardest part was yet to come. She had to decide when and how to reveal herself, knowing that the moment she did, everything would change. Alistair would know she had abandoned him. Roderick would know his scheme was exposed. And the world would know that the Duchess of Exmoor had risen from the dead. As Clara walked back toward the manor, the first light of dawn breaking over the hills, she made her decision. She would not wait for Roderick to make his next move. She would force his hand. She would bring the truth into the light, no matter the cost. There are moments in history when the air itself seems to hold its breath, when the world pauses on the edge of revelation and the outcome of everything hangs on a single action. For Exmoor Manor, that moment arrived on a fog-shrouded evening in late November, when the dining room blazed with candlelight and the table was set for a gathering that would determine the fate of the Sterling legacy. Roderick had planned it meticulously. The invitations had been sent a week prior, worded with careful precision to convey urgency without alarm. Lord Pemberton, the family solicitor, had arrived first, his grey wig slightly askew from the journey. Dr. Whitmore followed, the physician who had been treating Alistair's supposed illness, and who had grown increasingly convinced that the Duke was unfit to manage his affairs. Finally, Sir Edmund Hartley, the local magistrate, entered with the gravity befitting a man who would witness the legal transfer of power from one Sterling to another. They gathered in the drawing room before dinner, sipping sherry and speaking in hushed, respectful tones about the tragedy that had befallen the Duke. Roderick moved among them with practiced ease, his expression appropriately sombre, his words carefully chosen. "Gentlemen," he said, raising his glass, "I thank you for coming on such short notice. As you know, my cousin's condition has deteriorated significantly in recent months. The grief over Lady Clara's death, combined with the family illness that claimed his father, has rendered him unable to fulfill his duties. Tonight, I hope we can formalise the arrangements that will protect both the Duke and the estate." Lord Pemberton nodded gravely. "It is a difficult matter, but necessary. The Sterling name must be preserved." "Indeed," Roderick agreed. "I take no pleasure in this, but duty demands action." When dinner was announced, they moved to the dining room. The long mahogany table had been set with the finest silver and crystal, the candelabras casting dancing shadows on the walls. At the head of the table sat Alistair, and the sight of him sent a ripple of discomfort through the assembled men. The Duke of Exmoor looked like a man already half in the grave. His face was gaunt, his skin pale as parchment, and his eyes were glassy and unfocused. His hands trembled so violently that he could barely lift his wineglass. And when he spoke, his words were slurred and disjointed. "Gentlemen," he managed, his voice barely above a whisper, "you honour me with your presence." "Your Grace," Sir Hartley replied, taking his seat across from the Duke. "We are here to assist you in whatever way we can." Roderick sat at Alistair's right hand, positioned like a guardian or perhaps a warden. Throughout the first course, he dominated the conversation, speaking on behalf of the Duke when questions were directed at Alistair, interpreting his cousin's confused responses with the patience of a caretaker managing a child. "As you can see," Roderick said, gesturing subtly toward Alistair, who was struggling to hold his spoon steady. "The decline has been precipitous. He cannot manage correspondence. He wanders the grounds at night calling for his dead wife. Last week, he accused me of stealing his signet ring, only to find it in his own pocket hours later." Dr. Whitmore leaned forward, his gaze clinical as he studied Alistair. "Your Grace, do you remember what day it is?" Alistair blinked slowly, his brow furrowing with effort. "It is Tuesday." "It is Thursday," Roderick corrected gently. "You see, Doctor, the confusion is constant." The physician made a note in the small leather journal he carried. "The symptoms are consistent with advanced cognitive decline. I would recommend a formal declaration of incapacity." Lord Pemberton cleared his throat. "With all due respect, such a declaration is a grave matter. The Duke is young, only 34. Are we certain this condition is irreversible?" "I have consulted with specialists in London," Roderick replied smoothly. "They agree that the Sterling curse, as it is known in the family, is progressive and terminal. My cousin's father suffered the same fate. There is no cure, only management. And I believe the estate would be better served if I were appointed as legal guardian and regent until such time as the Duke recovers, though I fear that day may never come." Sir Hartley nodded slowly. "If the physician confirms the diagnosis, and if Lord Pemberton draws up the necessary documents, I see no legal impediment." Roderick allowed himself a small smile. "Then we are in agreement. I propose we sign the documents this evening so that the transition can begin immediately." "This evening?" Pemberton looked startled. "That is highly irregular. Surely we should allow time for review." "Time is a luxury we do not have," Roderick said, his tone hardening slightly. "The estate is already suffering from my cousin's inability to make decisions. Tenants are leaving, creditors are circling. Every day we delay is a day closer to ruin." As he spoke, Roderick reached for the decanter and poured more wine into Alistair's glass. "Drink, cousin," he urged. "It will steady your nerves." Alistair stared at the glass, his expression vacant. His hand moved toward it, trembling, but before his fingers could close around the stem, the candles flickered. A cold gust of wind swept through the room, though all the windows were shut tight. The flames danced wildly, casting grotesque shadows that seemed to writhe on the walls. And then the terrace doors, which had been closed and latched, swung open with a slow, deliberate creak. The fog had rolled in, thick and heavy, a white shroud that clung to the ground and obscured the gardens beyond. It poured into the dining room like a living thing, curling around the table legs and rising in wisps toward the ceiling. The men at the table froze, their conversations dying mid-sentence. From the fog emerged a figure. She was dressed in white, a gown of antique lace that belonged to another era, its fabric ghostly pale against the darkness. Her blonde hair hung loose around her shoulders, unbound and flowing like a maiden's, catching the candlelight in threads of gold. Her face was pale, ethereal, and her green eyes were fixed on the men at the table with an intensity that made the breath catch in every throat. For a moment, no one moved. No one spoke. The figure stood framed in the doorway, the fog swirling around her like a cloak, and the silence was so complete that the crackling of the fire in the hearth sounded like thunder. It was Roderick who broke first, his face drained of colour, turning a sickly grey. His hands gripped the edge of the table so tightly that his knuckles turned white. His mouth opened and closed wordlessly, like a fish pulled from water. And then a sound escaped him, a strangled gasp of pure terror. "Impossible," he whispered. And then louder, his voice rising to a shout. "Impossible! We found your shawl. We found your boot in the mud. The river took you. You drowned." The words hung in the air, damning and absolute. Every man at the table turned to stare at Roderick, their expressions shifting from shock to suspicion Why would he say, "We found"? Why would he insist she had drowned with such vehemence unless he had reason to want her dead? Clara took a step into the room, her movements slow and deliberate. She did not speak. She did not need to. Her presence was accusation enough. At the head of the table, Alistair's glazed eyes focused on her. For a moment, he simply stared, his mind struggling to reconcile the impossible with the real. He had seen Clara in his dreams, in his hallucinations, in the shadows that haunted his waking hours. But this was different. This Clara did not fade when he blinked. This Clara breathed, her chest rising and falling, her lips parted slightly as if she too was holding her breath. "Clara?" His voice was barely audible, a broken whisper of hope and disbelief. "Is it truly you?" She met his gaze, and in that moment, something passed between them. Recognition, understanding, forgiveness. The adrenaline that surged through Alistair's veins cut through the fog of the poison like a blade through silk. His mind, dulled and clouded for so long, sharpened with sudden terrifying clarity. He pushed himself to his feet, the chair scraping loudly against the floor. His hands still trembled, but his voice was stronger now. "You are alive." Clara nodded slowly, her eyes never leaving his. "I am alive, Alistair, and I have come home." Roderick stood abruptly, his expression wild. "This is a trick, an impostor. The woman drowned months ago." "Did she?" Sir Hartley said coldly, rising from his seat. His hand moved to the pistol he carried at his belt, a precaution all magistrates took when travelling at night. "Or did someone wish us to believe she drowned? Your reaction, Lord Roderick, suggests you know more about Lady Clara's death than you have revealed." "I know nothing," Roderick shouted, backing toward the door. "She is a ghost, a demon sent to torment us." "I am no ghost," Clara said, her voice steady and clear. She reached into the bodice of her gown and withdrew a folded paper, sealed with wax. "I am the Duchess of Exmoor, and I have evidence of crimes committed within these walls. Crimes against my husband. Crimes committed by you, Roderick Sterling." She held out the paper to Sir Hartley, who took it with a grave expression. As he broke the seal and read, his face darkened. "This is a chemical analysis," he said slowly, "signed by Mr. Finch, the apothecary. It states that the tonics and remedies provided to the Duke by Lord Roderick contain arsenic and belladonna. Poison." The room erupted. Dr. Whitmore stood, his face pale. Lord Pemberton knocked over his wine-glass, the red liquid spreading across the white tablecloth, like blood. And Alistair, his trembling hands curling into fists, turned to face his cousin. "You," he said, and the word carried the weight of betrayal and fury. "You have been poisoning me." Roderick's mask shattered completely. "You should have died," he screamed. "The title should have been mine. My father was the eldest. It was stolen from him by your grandfather's favoritism. I was owed this." He lunged toward the terrace doors, but Sir Hartley was faster. The magistrate caught him by the arm, dragging him back. "Roderick Sterling, you are under arrest for attempted murder and conspiracy." As Roderick was restrained, still shouting his grievances, Alistair's gaze returned to Clara. She stood in the centre of the chaos, unmoving, her white gown ethereal in the candlelight. Slowly, he walked toward her, his steps unsteady but determined. When he reached her, he raised a trembling hand and touched her cheek, his fingers brushing her skin as if to confirm she was real. "You came back," he whispered. "Even after everything, you came back." Clara's eyes filled with tears. "I never wanted to leave." Pshon, and as the guards arrived to take Roderick away, as the fog continued to pour through the open terrace doors, Alistair pulled Clara into his arms, holding her as though she might vanish again if he let go. The dining room did not empty all at once. It fractured, the way a struck mirror does, reality splintering into sharp-edged shards of movement and sound. Servants rushed in at the magistrate's shouted orders, their faces pale as they watched Lord Roderick Sterling, once so polished, so controlled, struggle like a trapped animal against the men restraining him. "Unhand me," he snarled, wrenching against their grip. "You fools, you have no idea what you're doing. The estate needs me. Without me, Exmoor will fall to ruin. Sir Edmund Hartley's voice cut cleanly through the chaos. What the estate needs, my lord, is a duke who is not being poisoned in his own home. You will hold your tongue if you value what remains of your dignity. Roderick spat at his feet, breathing hard. The fog pressing at the terrace doors blurred the edges of the scene, making it feel almost unreal. But the iron fury in Sir Edmund's eyes was very real. So was the tremble in Alistair's hand where it rested at the small of Clara's back, a subtle, protective pressure that had nothing to do with weakness and everything to do with instinct. "Remove him to the study," Sir Edmund ordered the footman and 2 estate guards. "I will take his formal statement there. He does not leave this house tonight." Roderick twisted once more, wild-eyed. His gaze found Clara, and a bitter, twisted smile curved his lips. "Well played, Your Grace," he said, the title dripping with venom. "You should have stayed dead. You've doomed him as surely as I ever could." "Enough," Alistair said, the word low but carrying. It had been months since he'd spoken with such authority, and even Roderick faltered at the sound of it. "You will not speak to my wife again." The familiar word, wife, struck Clara with as much force as anything else that evening. For the first time since she had fled into the storm, he had claimed her aloud. Not as an obligation, not as a ghost, as his. They dragged Roderick from the room. His protests faded down the corridor, swallowed by the thick walls of Exmoor Manor. The fog, no longer disturbed by new arrivals, began to thin, slipping back through the open doors as if it, too, had played its part and was now content to retreat. For a long moment, no one moved. Lord Pemberton was the first to recover. He cleared his throat, his wig slightly askew, his hands shaking as he dabbed at the wine staining his cuff. "Your Grace," he said, inclining his head to Clara with the respect due her rank, and only then to Alistair, "I believe there are matters of both law and reputation that require immediate discussion." Dr. Whitmore still stared at the folded analysis on the table. His brow furrowed. He looked up, guilt shadowing his features. "I have grossly misjudged your condition, Your Grace," he told Alistair. "The symptoms were consistent with a degenerative disorder, but I failed to consider deliberate interference. For that, I offer no excuse." Alistair's gaze was steadier than it had any right to be, given the poison still in his veins. "You were given only the evidence Roderick wished you to see," he said. "I will address your continued services at a later date. Tonight, there are other priorities." His hand, still resting at Clara's back, curled slightly, as though reassuring himself that she had not dissolved with the fog. She could feel the faint tremor in his fingertips, the remnants of the drug that had held him captive for so long. It ignited a cold burn in her chest, a mix of rage at what had been done to him and an aching tenderness that made her throat tighten. Sir Edmund closed the distance between them, tucking the apothecary's report into his coat. "Your Graces," he said, the plural deliberate. "I will remain on the estate tonight to oversee Roderick's confinement. At first light, I will send word to the circuit judge in Exeter, requesting a warrant and advising him of the attempted murder charge. I would also recommend a private account of your disappearance, Your Grace," he added to Clara. "Before rumour fills in the gaps with something less convenient than the truth." Clara inclined her head. "You shall have it," she said. Her voice sounded calm, almost detached, but inside, the room seemed to sway. The candlelight blurred around the edges of her vision. The long journey, the hunger, the constant tension of hiding, the strain of the confrontation, all of it had drawn her reserves down to threads. Alistair felt it. His hand left her back and slid to her arm, fingers firm, steadying. "Enough for tonight," he said, and this time, there was no room for argument in his tone. "My wife has travelled far and endured more than any of us. Whatever statements must be taken can be done on the morrow." Sir Edmund looked as though he wished to protest, but he studied Clara's face, the paleness beneath the candlelight, the shadows beneath her eyes, and thought better of it. "Very well," he conceded. "I will have the guards posted outside Roderick's door. No one goes in or out without my consent." He bowed once more and left with Lord Pemberton and Dr. Whitmore in tow, their voices dropping to a murmur as they disappeared into the hall. The remaining servants hovered uncertainly near the door, torn between curiosity and terror. "Leave us," Alistair said, not raising his voice. The command was quiet, but absolute. They obeyed at once. The dining room door closed with a soft click, and suddenly the vast space felt too intimate, too charged. The table, with its scattered silver and half-eaten courses, seemed absurdly mundane after what had just transpired. The candles hissed softly, their flames much diminished. Clara realized she was shaking. For a long heartbeat, neither of them spoke. Alistair's hand remained on her arm, anchoring her. She stared at the linen cloth, at the stain of spilled wine that had spread into a dark bloom near Roderick's empty chair. It looked like blood. "I am not hallucinating, am I?" he asked at last, his voice low, almost hoarse. "You are truly here." She raised her gaze to his. The blue of his eyes was clearer now, the dull film of poison receding. They searched her face with an intensity that made her want to look away and never look away in the same breath. "I am here," she said. "Not a ghost, not a dream." His throat worked as he swallowed. Slowly, as if afraid the movement might break whatever fragile spell held reality together, he lifted his hand from her arm and touched her cheek. His fingers were warm, calloused, the touch both familiar and new. His breath hitched. "I have seen you in every shadow," he said, "at the end of every corridor, in every dream. And each time, you vanished when I reached for you." His hand moved to cup her jaw, his thumb brushing the corner of her mouth. "You are not vanishing." "No," she whispered. Emotion tightened her chest until the word was little more than air. "Not this time." Something in him seemed to give way. He stepped closer, erasing the last formality of distance between them, and then his arms were around her, gathering her against him with a desperation that took her breath. He held her as though he meant to fuse their bones together, his face buried in the curve of her neck, his breath hot and uneven against her skin. Clara's own arms rose, almost of their own accord, her fingers curling into the fabric of his coat. He smelled of smoke and damp wool, and the faint, bitter tang of the tonic that had nearly killed him. Beneath it all, she recognized the underlying scent that had always been his. Sandalwood, leather, something indefinably masculine and uniquely Alistair. "I am so sorry," he said, the words muffled against her shoulder, raw in a way she had never heard from him. "God, Clara, I am so sorry. I thought—" His voice broke, and his hold on her tightened. "I thought I had killed you. I thought my cowardice had driven you to the river." Her eyes stung. "I chose the riverbank," she said softly. "I chose the shawl, the boot. That was my own cowardice, not yours." He drew back just enough to look at her, his hands framing her face now, thumbs brushing away tears she had not realized had fallen. "Do not call yourself that," he said fiercely. "You were alone in a house where your husband would not touch you, would not explain his absence, would not give you a single reason to believe you were anything but a burden he had been forced to shoulder. I made this marriage a prison and expected you to thank me for the bars." The blunt truth of it slashed through her, but there was no evasion in his gaze, no attempt to soften his culpability. For the first time, she saw not the remote, perfectly controlled Duke, but a man stripped bare of defences. "You were dying," she said, the words coming out in a rush now, driven by the need to make sense of the senseless. "I saw you at the lodge. I watched you fall to your knees before Mrs. Halloway, begging her to make it stop, but you never told me. You never trusted me with the truth. I could not bear for you to see what was coming," he said. His hands slid from her face to her shoulders, holding her like a man clinging to a piece of wreckage in a storm. "I watched my father disintegrate. The shaking, the confusion, the rage. The nights when he did not know his own name, let alone my mother's. He begged for death in the end." His jaw clenched. "When my own hands began to shake, I swore I would never inflict that on a wife." "So you inflicted something else," she replied quietly. Silence, distance, indifference. "You thought those would hurt me less than watching you suffer." He closed his eyes briefly, as if the question itself were a lash. I thought you would grow to hate me and be grateful for the separation when the illness took me, that you would be free to remarry, to find a man who could give you a husband in truth. His eyes opened again, and the anguish in them was almost unbearable. Instead, I broke you, then drove you into the arms of a river while I was too blind to see what my cousin was pouring down my throat. Clara's fingers loosened their grip on his coat. She let her hands slide down, resting them over his chest. Beneath the layers of fabric, his heart hammered against her palm, fast and unsteady. You did not drive me to the river, she said, each word deliberate. I walked there on my own feet, with my own bitterness for company. I did not drown because of your illness or your silence. I drowned because I chose to believe the worst of you instead of demanding the truth. His brow furrowed. You saw Mrs. Halloway. You had every reason to believe what you did. Perhaps, she allowed. But I also knew you were not cruel. You were cold, yes, but you were never cruel. A braver woman might have burst into that lodge and demanded an explanation instead of running into the night like a frightened girl. You were 22, he reminded her. A bride discarded on her own wedding night and ignored for 2 years after. Do not speak of yourself as if you should have been made of iron. Her throat tightened again. He remembered, not just the broad strokes of their history, but the humiliating details she had tried so hard to bury. I lay awake beside a man who would not look at me, she whispered. For 2 years, Alistair. I began to believe there was something wrong with me, something repellent. Nothing, he said, and the word came out like an oath. Nothing has ever been wrong with you. The fault was entirely mine. I thought that if I kept my distance, if I refused intimacy, the blow would be softer when the disease took me. I did not anticipate that you would interpret my restraint as disgust, or that Roderick would seize upon that distance as the perfect veil for his own designs. The name hung between them like a stain. Roderick, cousin, would-be murderer, architect of their mutual torment. Clara stepped back slightly, enough to draw a steadying breath and reach into her bodice again. She withdrew the second paper Finch had pressed into her hand before she left the village. A more detailed explanation of the poisoning, written in plain language for non-physicians, in case the legal authorities required further clarification. I went to Mr. Finch, she said, placing the paper on the table beside them, near the still damp bloom of wine. I took Roderick's vials. He confirmed the presence of arsenic and belladonna. It was never your father's illness returning. It was deliberate, calculated poison. Every time you drank at Roderick's urging, every tonic he pressed on you, he tightened the noose around your neck a little more. Alistair's gaze dropped to the paper, but did not linger there. Instead, he turned his head, looking at the half-empty decanter near his abandoned place at the table. His jaw flexed. I thought, he said slowly, that the worst thing I had done was to marry you and then proceed to ruin your life with my fear. I did not realize I had also placed my neck upon the block and handed my cousin the axe. He looked back at her, and something steely, something old and inherent to the Sterling line, kindled beneath the anguish in his eyes. That ends tonight. His reach ends tonight. It already has, she said. Sir Edmund will not let him slip away quietly. Neither will the evidence. Neither will I. For the first time, a huff of something like humour ghosted across his lips. It was brittle, but it was there. No, he agreed. I imagine you will not. Silence fell again, but it was different now. Not the suffocating, empty quiet that had haunted their dinners for 2 years. This silence crackled with everything unsaid, with the weight of what they had both survived and the uncertain shape of what might come next. Clara became acutely aware of her own body again, of the ache in her lower back, the pull of fatigue in every limb, of the deep, unfamiliar heaviness low in her abdomen, a reminder of the life quietly growing there. The room tilted very slightly, the candles blurring. Alistair's hand shot out, steadying her elbow. You are exhausted, he said. I have kept you standing here far too long. She opened her mouth to protest, to say there were still so many things to discuss, So many apologies to make and to receive. But the words tangled. The fatigue was not merely from the day. It was cumulative, woven from months of labour, hunger, fear, and long cold nights in the East Wing. You said earlier, he continued more gently, that the riverbank was your own foolishness, not mine. Whatever foolishness was involved, I do not intend to let you collapse now as some sort of penance for my failures. His gaze softened further. Come, you need rest. We will face Sir Edmund and Lord Pemberton and the gossip of the entire county tomorrow. Tonight, I will see you safely to bed. She stared at him. To my old rooms? She asked, the question sharper than she intended. Her mind conjured the familiar chamber in the West Wing, the polished furniture, the untouched bed, the echoing emptiness. His expression tightened, not with annoyance, but with something closer to shame. To whichever rooms you choose, he said carefully. Your old chamber, the East Wing, the mistress suite. This house is yours as much as it is mine. But if you are asking whether I mean to send you to one wing while I retreat to another, he shook his head once. No, not again. I will not force solitude upon you as some twisted form of mercy. If you wish me gone, you may dismiss me with a word. But the choice will be yours this time, not mine. Her fingers tightened in the folds of her skirt. The idea of sharing a corridor, a hearth, a bed with him felt both like a promise and a precipice. Too much. Too night, she said slowly. I do not think I could bear to be alone in any room in this house. Not after... She glanced toward the empty doorway where Roderick had been dragged away. Not after that. Something unclenched in his features. A small, unmistakable easing. He inclined his head. Then you shall not be alone, he said simply. We will sort out the details of bedrooms and propriety when neither of us is on the verge of collapsing. For now, allow me at least this much as your husband. Let me walk beside you. She nodded once. They left the dining room together, side by side. It was a simple act, walking down the corridor, but to Clara it felt like crossing a threshold. The portraits of stern-faced Sterlings watched them as they passed, witnesses to the awkward, halting beginning of something that might one day resemble partnership. At the foot of the main staircase, she hesitated, fingers gripping the polished banister. The climb looked steeper than she remembered. Alistair noticed. We will move slowly, he said. I am not in much condition to race up them myself. She glanced at him, at the faint sheen of sweat on his brow, the lingering pallor beneath his skin. You should be in bed as well, she murmured. You have been forced upright by fury and shock. That is not the same as being well. His mouth tipped at one corner. Are you scolding me, Duchess? Perhaps, she said. Someone ought to. The corner of his mouth lifted further, and then he offered his arm, not as a polite stranger, not as a distant guardian, as a man who intended to be her support in more ways than one. She took it. They climbed. At the top of the stairs, she paused again, instinct pulling her toward the familiar turning that led to her old rooms. Alistair said nothing, merely followed where she led. When she opened the door, a strange chill slid down her spine. Nothing had changed. The bed was still made in the same crisp fashion, the coverlet uncreased. The curtains hung exactly as she had left them. Her writing desk stood by the window, inkpot sealed, papers stacked neatly. A shawl lay folded over the back of a chair, another one she had favoured in those barren days. It might have been yesterday that she walked out into the storm instead of months ago. No one has used this room? She asked, not turning. No, he said quietly behind her. I could not bear to have it disturbed. Her fingers brushed the back of the chair. Even the servants believed I was dead, she murmured. Yet you preserved my chamber. I buried you, he answered, and the words were rough-edged. I watched them carve your name into stone. I listened to the earth fall on an empty coffin, but I could not bring myself to erase the last place where you had been alive. She closed her eyes for a moment, then turned. He stood just inside the doorway, shoulders squared as if preparing for judgment. The Duke of Exmoor, stripped of pretense, waiting to learn whether his wife would exile him in truth this time. You will stay? She asked. Tonight? "If you wish it," he said. "I will sit by the hearth or on that chair or on the floor if necessary. I will not impose—" "Alistair." She did not raise her voice, but he stopped instantly. "If I wished you gone, I would have stayed in Whitby, or France, or anywhere but here." She drew a breath, steadying herself. "I do not know what tomorrow will bring. I do not know how to forgive 2 years in a single night. But I know this. I do not want to spend another night in this bed, imagining walls between us that do not have to be there." His eyes darkened, not with desire. That would have been too simple. But with something deeper, more fragile. Hope, fear, reverence. "Then I will stay," he said. He moved further into the room, closing the door softly behind him. The fire in the grate had long since burned to embers, but he crossed to it and knelt, adding logs from the basket, coaxing new flame to life with a patience that made her chest ache. When warmth finally began to creep into the chill air, he rose and stood at the foot of the bed, uncertain. Clara sat on the edge of the mattress, suddenly acutely aware of every inch of her own skin, of the way her nightgown clung a little more tightly than it once had across her abdomen. She placed a hand there reflexively. Alistair's gaze followed the movement, his brows drawing together. "Clara," he said slowly, "when I held you earlier, there was something different. Are you—" "Yes," she said, the word catching in her throat. She forced herself to meet his eyes. "I am with child." For a moment, there was nothing. No sound, no movement. The fire crackled softly, oblivious. Alistair simply stared at her, his expression blank with shock, all the colour draining from his face. "Mine?" he asked at last, and the question was so nakedly vulnerable that it shattered whatever irritation she might have felt at the reflexive doubt. "There has been no one else," she replied. "There was only you. Only once." Her fingers tightened over the slight curve. "The timing is cruel, or merciful. I have not yet decided." Something like a sob escaped him, half laugh, half gasp. He moved as if pulled by a tide, crossing the space between them and sinking to his knees before her. His hands hovered for a moment. Then very gently, as though touching something sacred, he placed them over hers. "You carry my child," he said, as if reciting a fact that his mind could not yet quite grasp. "When I believed I had ended your life, you were carrying the continuation of mine." Tears blurred her vision. "I did not return for you alone," she admitted. "I returned because I could not bear to raise this child on lies, to let our son or daughter grow believing their father indifferent, or to let you die believing there was nothing left of you in the world." His grip tightened, not on her, but on his own emotion. He bowed his head, pressing his forehead lightly against her hands and the swell beneath them. His shoulders shook once. "You have given me back more than my life tonight," he said. "You have given me back my future. Ours, if you will have it." She slid one hand free and threaded her fingers into his dark hair, the movement tentative but intentional. He looked up at her, and in his eyes she saw not the distant Duke who had once turned away from her with cool politeness, but a man stripped bare by suffering and seared clean by it. "I will not promise forgiveness all at once," she said, "or perfect trust. Those things will take time. They will require honesty. No more noble lies, no more deciding what is best for me without my consent. You have my word," he said immediately. "No more walls, no more secrets. If my hands tremble, you will see them. If my mind grows dark, you will know it. If there is fear, we face it together." "And if there is joy?" she asked, her voice very soft. His mouth curved, slow and incredulous, as if the word itself were something new. "Then we share that too." She nodded once, then shifted, making room for him on the bed. He rose, moved carefully to sit beside her, and when she lay back, he lay down as well, not reaching for her at once, but close enough that the heat of his body seeped through the linen. Tentatively, as the fire burned low and the shadows on the ceiling shifted, she moved closer. His arm came around her automatically, drawing her against his chest, his hand resting over hers, where it still protected the new, fragile life between them. For the first time since their wedding day, they slept in the same bed. Outside, the fog slowly lifted from the grounds of Exmoor. In the family mausoleum, the empty grave with Clara's name stood silent under the moon, a monument to a lie that would soon be buried deeper than any coffin. And in the dark, quiet house, the Duke and Duchess of Exmoor lay wrapped not in silence, but in the first, tentative threads of something that might yet become a home. There are truths too dangerous to speak aloud in drawing rooms, and lies too necessary to abandon entirely. In the weeks following Roderick Sterling's arrest, the corridors of power in London buzzed with whispers about the scandal at Exmoor. A duke nearly murdered by his own cousin. A duchess risen from the dead. The story had all the elements of Gothic romance and political intrigue that society craved, but it also had the potential to destroy reputations and upend the careful order of the peerage. Weeks later, when the first letters began to go out from Exmoor again, Clara wrote to Mrs. Gable in Whitby. She enclosed a sum that would mean little to a duchess and everything to a seamstress, and a single line of truth beneath the careful lies about a dead husband. You saved me when I did not know I wished to be saved. Lord Pemberton understood this better than most. He sat across from Alistair and Clara in the renovated morning room of Exmoor Manor, his wig freshly powdered, his expression grave. The room had been opened to sunlight for the first time in months, the heavy drapes pulled back, the windows thrown wide to let in the crisp air of early spring. It was a deliberate choice on Clara's part, a symbolic banishment of the darkness that had suffocated the house for so long. The facts, as they stand, are indelicate, Pemberton said, choosing his words with the precision of a man who had spent 40 years drafting legal documents. Her Grace fled the estate believing herself unwanted. She staged her own death. She lived under an assumed name for months. While the circumstances are sympathetic, the scandal alone could taint the Sterling name for generations. Alistair's jaw tightened. His hands, resting on the arms of his chair, no longer trembled. 3 weeks of careful detoxification under Dr. Whitmore's supervision, combined with proper rest and nourishment, had restored much of his strength. The hollows in his cheeks had filled, the fog in his eyes had cleared, and the tremor that had plagued him for so long had faded to nothing. It had never been the Sterling curse. It had been Roderick's methodical attempt at fratricide, and now Roderick awaited trial in Exeter jail. "What do you propose?" Alistair asked, his voice level but edged with steel. "That we lie to protect the sensibilities of people who would gossip over our graves as readily as our breakfast table?" Pemberton inclined his head. "Not a lie, Your Grace. A refinement of the truth. One that protects both Her Grace's reputation and your own." Clara sat beside Alistair, her posture straight, her hands folded over the slight swell of her abdomen that was now visible beneath the soft muslin of her gown. She had not spoken yet, content to let the solicitor present his case, but her green eyes missed nothing. "Go on," she said quietly. Pemberton withdrew a sheaf of papers from his leather case. The official account, should you choose to adopt it, would be as follows. On the night of the storm, Her Grace did indeed fall into the river. However, she was not drowned, but swept downstream and rescued by travellers. Servants of a distant abbey, perhaps, or a merchant passing through. Disoriented and injured, she was taken to a convent in the north, where the sisters cared for her. He paused, glancing between them. During her recovery, Her Grace suffered from a temporary loss of memory, a condition not uncommon after severe trauma. It was only recently, upon regaining her faculties, that she recalled her true identity and arranged for her return to Exmoor. The silence that followed was heavy. Clara looked at Alistair, reading the tension in the set of his shoulders. He hated it. She could see that clearly. He hated the idea of presenting fiction as fact, of bowing to society's demand for a palatable narrative, but she also understood the necessity. "And what of Roderick's trial?" she asked. "How does this story account for his crimes?" "Roderick's poisoning of the Duke is a separate matter," Pemberton said smoothly. "It will be prosecuted on the evidence provided by Mr. Finch and the testimony of Dr. Whitmore. The two events need not be conflated. Roderick saw an opportunity in the Duke's grief and isolation following your supposed death, and he exploited it. That remains true under either version of events. Neither Sir Edmund nor Pemberton looked pleased by the compromise. They were not fools nor sentimental men. They saw the truth as clearly as the ink on the page. But they also understood what decades of whispered scandal could do to a name, and to the child who would one day bear it. Alistair leaned forward, his gaze sharp. You are asking us to protect the institution at the expense of honesty. I am asking you to protect your child, Pemberton countered gently, nodding toward Clara's abdomen. When the heir to Exmoor is born, do you wish the first whispers to be of scandal and abandonment? Or would you prefer a story of miraculous survival and reunion? The peerage has a long memory, Your Grace. What is written now will follow your family for decades. Clara placed a hand over Alistair's, stilling the restless movement of his fingers. He is right, she said softly. I despise it as much as you do. But our child deserves better than to be the subject of drawing-room gossip before they draw their first breath. Alistair turned his hand beneath hers, threading their fingers together. For a long moment, he stared at their joined hands, then exhaled slowly. Very well, he said. We will adopt your version of events, Pemberton. But I will not embellish it further. The convent, the amnesia, the return, that is all society will receive from us. If they wish to speculate beyond that, let them do so without our cooperation. Pemberton smiled faintly. A wise compromise, Your Grace. The narrative was disseminated with the efficiency of a military campaign. Letters were sent to the major houses, to the Prince Regent's secretary, to the editors of the society pages. Within a fortnight, the miracle of the Duchess of Exmoor's survival was the talk of every London salon. Some, naturally, expressed scepticism, but the weight of the Sterling name and the involvement of the Church, the Abbess of St. Hilda's, had been persuaded to provide a carefully worded confirmation, silenced most doubts. The trial of Roderick Sterling, by contrast, was conducted with ruthless speed. The evidence was damning. Mr. Finch's chemical analysis. Dr. Whitmore's testimony regarding the Duke's symptoms. The servants who had witnessed Roderick's controlling behaviour in the months following Clara's disappearance. Roderick himself, in a final act of hubris, took the stand and attempted to justify his actions, claiming that the Sterling title should have passed through his father's line and that he had only sought to correct a historical injustice. The jury deliberated for less than an hour. Roderick Sterling was found guilty of attempted murder and sentenced to transportation to the penal colonies of Australia, a fate considered merciful only because the alternative was the gallows. He was removed from the courtroom in chains, still shouting about his stolen birthright, and the doors of Exmoor Manor closed on that chapter of the Sterling history forever. By late April, the worst of the scandal had faded, replaced by the fresher gossip of other families. Alistair and Clara were left finally to the business of rebuilding not just the estate, but the fragile architecture of their marriage. It was a process that required patience. There were mornings when Clara woke and, for a disorienting moment, forgot where she was, her mind still clinging to the cold, narrow bed in Whitby. There were evenings when Alistair would reach for a glass of wine and then freeze, staring at it with suspicion before setting it aside untouched. They were both scarred by what had been done to them and to each other, and scars did not heal overnight. But slowly, in increments so small they were almost imperceptible, trust began to take root. Alistair kept his promise. When the nightmares came, and they did, vivid dreams of drowning, of poison, of empty graves, he did not retreat to his study to suffer alone. He woke Clara, and she held him, and together they waited for the dawn. When Clara struggled with the nausea and fatigue of her advancing pregnancy, he did not delegate her care to servants. He brought her tea himself, sat with her when she could not sleep, and read aloud from the novels she loved until her breathing steadied. They walked the estate together, inspecting the fields that had been neglected during Alistair's illness, meeting with tenants who had feared for their futures under Roderick's stewardship. Alistair made amends where he could, restoring wages, repairing cottages, listening to grievances with a humility that surprised even Clara. "You are different," she told him one afternoon, as they stood on the hill overlooking the western pastures. The lambs had been born, and the fields were alive with their bleating. He glanced at her, his dark hair ruffling in the breeze. Different? How? Softer, she said, then amended quickly. No, not soft. Present. You are here in a way you never were before. He considered this, his gaze returning to the fields. I was so consumed with protecting you from a future I believed was inevitable that I failed to live in the present we had, he said. I will not make that mistake again. She slipped her hand into his, and he squeezed it gently. It was in mid-May, when the gardens of Exmoor were in full, riotous bloom, that Clara suggested they walk to the family mausoleum. Alistair had avoided it since her return, unable to face the monument to his greatest mistake. But she insisted, and he could deny her nothing now. They walked in silence through the rose garden, past the topiaries that were slowly being restored to their former precision, and up the gentle slope to the white marble structure that housed generations of Sterlings. The door stood open, as it always did during the day, and the interior was cool and shadowed. Clara's empty grave was near the back, a fresh slab of marble that bore her name and the dates of a life that had never ended. I want it removed, Alistair said abruptly, his voice rough. I cannot bear to see it. Then let us remove it. Clara agreed. She turned to him, taking both his hands. Let us replace it with something true. A marker for the child we lost before I fled. The life that was never given the chance to begin. Or a memorial to what we survived, but not a lie carved in stone. His throat worked as he swallowed. I never knew, he said quietly, about the child. Before. There was nothing to know, she replied. I miscarried within weeks of our wedding. I told no one, not even the physician. It was too early, too fragile. I thought it was a sign that even my body rejected the idea of bearing your heir. His hands tightened on hers. Clara, I do not believe that anymore, she said, cutting him off gently. I understand now that it was simply loss, not punishment, not rejection, just the cruelty of chance. He pulled her into his arms, holding her as the shadows of the mausoleum lengthened around them. We will commission a new stone, he said, for the child we lost, and we will leave this place behind. When our son or daughter is born, they will not grow up under the shadow of ghosts. No, Clara agreed, resting her head against his chest. They will grow up knowing the truth, all of it. The mistakes, the pain, the recovery. They will know that love is not a fairy tale, but a choice made every day. By the time June arrived, Clara's pregnancy had advanced to the point where her movements were slower, more deliberate. The child within her was active, kicking at odd hours, and Alistair had taken to resting his hand on her abdomen in the evenings, marvelling at the life they had created. One warm afternoon, they walked through the gardens together, Clara's arm linked through his for balance. The staff had rebuilt the rose arbour, and the scent of blooms hung heavy in the air. Bees hummed lazily among the flowers, and the distant sound of sheep carried on the breeze. Do you think we will be good parents? Clara asked suddenly. Alistair looked down at her, surprised by the question. I think, he said slowly, that we will make mistakes. But I also think we will face them together, and that is more than many children receive. She smiled, a real smile that reached her eyes. I think you are right. They reached the centre of the garden, where a new bench had been placed beneath an ancient oak. Alistair helped her sit, then joined her, stretching his long legs out before him. I have been thinking, he said, about what to tell our child. When they are old enough to ask about the scar on the mausoleum floor, or why their mother disappeared for months before they were born. And what will you tell them? Clara asked. The truth, he said simply, that their father was a coward who thought he could protect their mother by pushing her away. That their mother was brave enough to flee a life that had become unbearable, and braver still to return when she learned the truth. That love is not perfect, and neither are the people who try to build it, but it is worth fighting for all the same. Clara's eyes filled with tears, and she leaned her head against his shoulder. They will be fortunate to have you as a father, They will be fortunate to have you as a mother, he countered. I am merely the cautionary tale. She laughed, the sound bright and unburdened, and he felt something in his chest ease, a tightness he had carried for so long that he had forgotten it was there. As the sun dipped lower, painting the sky in shades of gold and rose, they sat together in the garden of Exmoor. The ghosts of their past finally laid to rest. The empty grave would be removed. The lies would be replaced with truth, and the child growing between them would be the living proof that even the deepest fractures could be mended, if both parties were willing to do the work. No more silence, Alistair said quietly, the words a vow. No more secrets, Clara replied, sealing the promise. And as the first stars appeared in the darkening sky, the Duke and Duchess of Exmoor began the slow, steady work of building a future worthy of the legacy they would leave behind. Not one of perfection, but one of honesty, resilience, and a love forged in the fires of suffering and tempered by the grace of second chances. May you too find the courage to face the truths you have been hiding, and may you sleep peacefully tonight, knowing that even the deepest wounds can heal when met with patience, honesty, and the willingness to try again.